Hi, everyone. Is that too loud? This is good? Okay.
It's good.
Thanks. All right, hi. Welcome. I'm so excited to see so many new faces in the audience tonight. My name is Anna Barros. I'm the chairwoman of The Politic, which, for those of you who don't know, we are Yale's oldest and, at this point, only political and cultural journal. So since 1947, we've provided an outlet for politically inclined students on campus, and over the years have come to define this word politics more broadly. So we started writing pieces about art and culture and science, and through that have learned how to look for the political in the intersection of all of those things. We've also expanded to other mediums beyond our magazine with a website that is newly redesigned. And we have, and is updated daily. We also have in the past had podcasts. We currently have a blog, and we are about to actually start on Yale's first political documentary series. So a lot of exciting things coming up. And finally, we have our Politic Presents Speaker Series, which Adam, our director of the speaker series, will introduce a little bit. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time before our guest of honor comes up on stage, but I do want to take a moment to thank all of you for being here and to thank the people who have made this possible. So we have the Pointer Fellowship for helping us out, having been so generous and so energetic about this event, and also the wonderful members of our board who are here today. So we couldn't have asked for, honestly, a better speaker to kickstart our politics series and the year for us. So with that, I will introduce Adam Jarrett, our Director of Speaker Events. Yeah.
Until the people who deserve it come on stage for both of them. So of course, but I have the unfortunate time of being much less impressive than the person speaking both before and after me, so I'll be very brief so we can get to what we're all very excited to hear about. But first, I do want to explain what the Politic Presents Speaker Series is. It's our monthly speaker series this year, and we bring speakers from all sorts of different fields, politics, media, and they're going to come here to share their stories with you, their experiences with you, and we are so excited about bringing a speaker to campus every single month of the year. So please do stay tuned to see who our upcoming speakers will be. But I can think of no one better, as Anna said before, to kick off this year's series than the man I'm about to introduce, John Dickerson. So Mr. Dickerson is one of the most influential news anchors of the day. As host of CBS's Face The Nation, he has interviewed members of Congress, ambassadors, and the nation's top political officials. In the past year, he has helped shape the national conversation on upcoming elections with the interviews of Trump, Obama, and Clinton, and his moderation of a Democratic presidential debate this year drew praise from viewers and political commentators across the aisle. In the past, Mr. Dickerson has also reported on the White House, Congress, and economics in Washington for almost 20 years, and in addition to serving as host, of course, of Face The Nation. Mr. Dickerson also hosts a monthly podcast called Whistlestop, which chronicles notable moments in presidential history. And it is also the name of his new book, which we will hear quite a bit about tonight, I certainly hope. Also, if anyone in the audience has any questions for Mr. Dickerson, you receive note cards, hopefully walking in from either entrance here. And please do pass them to the sides of your rows, and Ann and I will collect them, and we will share them with Mr. Dickerson before the event ends, but please do pass them up by 5:20 p.m., which is when we will walk around and collect them. Before I bring him up to the stage now, I want to leave you all with a quote the Washington Post once wrote about Mr. Dickerson's style of questioning. The master of the game is John Dickerson. The master of the game is John Dickerson of Time magazine, who has knocked Bush off script so many times that his colleagues have coined a term for cleverly worded, seemingly harmless, but incisive questions, as Dickersonian. I hope he's ready to turn the tables tonight with our editors-in-chief, Zach Cohen and Maddie Colbert. So please join me in a round of applause while we welcome all three of them to the stage right now.
Hi. Thanks everybody for coming.
This is where.
Hi.
right. Thank you everyone for being here today. Before we get started with our questions, we'll just say a few words about ourselves. So my name is Zachary Cohen. I am a junior in Calvin College from New York City. I'm also one of the 2 editors-in-chief of The Politic this year. And when I'm not doing that, I am majoring in history and political science.
Hi, my name is Maddie Colbert. I'm the co-editor with Zach. I am a junior from New Jersey, and I am majoring in just history. I'm slightly more slacker than Zach. Okay, so to get started, we just heard about the book that you have recently published, but you've also written another book about your mother and her career titled On Her Trail. And this discusses your mother's career as the first female news correspondent. Tell us a little bit about how your mom's career impacted your career path, and in general, what about journalism drew you to where you are today?
So just to give a little history about my mom and who she was, first, I think the first part of the history we have to give is that there was a period in my life when I was an adolescent, probably until I was about 21, that the idea that I would be at Yale talking about my mother in anything other than using nothing but swear words would have been a shock to me. We had a pretty rough relationship for a big portion of our life, right about the time my parents got divorced. So that's important context, because otherwise it's just like a guy saying nice things about his mother. Anyway, she was the first woman news correspondent for CBS, which was a big deal in 1960. There weren't any women on TV. It was just men. There were basically three television networks. There were really 2. ABC was not. It was CBS and NBC. And so being the first woman was a big deal, because everybody kind of gathered around and watched the evening news. That's what you did. And so to see a woman there was surprising. It was, she was also quite close to both John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, because she worked on the Hill. So that was her career path. It is a surprise that, and so she was on TV from 1960 to about 1975. It's surprising that I would have gone into journalism because of this relationship that I had with her, which was quite rocky. But what happened basically was that after I left college, I wanted to tell stories. I thought I would be either a writer of novels, or that I would go back and get a master's in English literature, which is what I had studied as an undergraduate in addition to history, or that I became a lawyer or something. But journalism was not on the list. But I knew I wanted to live in New York, and I knew I needed a job, so I became a secretary at Time Inc., and that put me in connection or in close proximity to journalists. And once I saw the stories they were telling at Time, at the time, Time magazine told stories in a different way than they do today. They were a little bit more like narrative nonfiction, and that seemed like a great way to tell stories. So I started trying to just weasel my way into the newsroom by just hanging around and being there to get coffee or do research or whatever. And as I started to get assigned stories, mostly starting out with terrorism, this was about the first attack on the World Trade Center happened at this time. And they needed warm bodies to just go into mosques in Jersey City and go down and talk to cops. And my mom, who lived in New York at that time, you know, she knew how to be a reporter. She was one. So she was there as a resource. And that began or continued the kind of putting back together of our relationship. And the reason I wrote the book is she then died pretty shortly thereafter. And she left me all of her materials, about 42 lawyer's boxes. And one lawyer's box is about that big, full of everything from like her journals when she was a 6-year-old, writing about the girl who beat her out for the boy at the dance, to letters she exchanged with Johnson and Kennedy, and her journals all the way along the way, which charted her rise and then her rather precipitous fall, the breakup of my parents' marriage, all this stuff that I didn't know anything about. So that's what that book's about.
And my understanding is she was one of the original producers of Face the Nation, the show you now host. So how does that take over?
Yeah, so again, I would never guess that. She was what was called an associate in production, which was very low on the totem pole in the very first episode of Face the Nation. And her, the reason she'd been helpful, this of course she was ever on TV, but she got Joe McCarthy, who was on that first show, the senator from Wisconsin. She was from Wisconsin. She basically helped book him on the show. So that was a big coup to get McCarthy. He was in the middle of being, or was about to be censured by the Senate. And on the show, he called the Senate inquiry into his behavior a lynch bee, which is basically lynching. He was already not in good odor with his Senate colleagues. saying they were trying to lynch him basically sunk him, and it was a big deal for him to go on TV and say that. That first show, I don't know if it's on YouTube or not, but it's very funny to watch TV back in 1954. The big deal with Face the Nation was they'd have remote, and there's a guy named Jep Cadieux who's in St. Louis, and they throw the remote to him, but it's like he's on another planet. So they say, "Come in, Jep Cadieux," and so television's changed a little bit since then, but that was the first show, and she worked on it.
Now, about your time on Face the Nation, other journalists have come up with their own term for your particular interviewing style. A few minutes ago, Adam read a quote from the Washington Post about your cleverly worded, seemingly harmless but incisive questions. And so, to give the audience an example, in response to one of your questions in 2004 when you were covering the White House, President Bush even admitted that he wishes you had given him this question ahead of time so he could plan for it. And so me and Maddie wish that we had asked you this question ahead of time so we could plan for it. But when you're preparing for a big interview, how do you come up with those Dickersonian questions?
Well, because I worked for Time Magazine and then for Slate for so long, you can ask different kinds of questions. When you're on a deadline for a wire or for a newspaper, you have to ask questions that are about the news. It's right at the margin of whatever's happening right now. So you're constrained by what you're trying to produce. When you're writing news magazine stories, you can spend weeks with people and have conversations and come back to stuff. And what that does is it gives you a lot more freedom to ask questions where you just open up and ask super broad questions. What you're hoping to try and do is get people to explain the way they think. And also with politicians in particular, they have a certain set of talking points, they have a certain speech, they have very busy days. They don't have a lot of time for innovative and entrepreneurial thinking because they're just constantly talking. So they take their speeches and they just chop them up and then they feed them out as they're asked questions. That's not terribly nourishing, especially as you get into a campaign and you feel like you're hearing the same thing over and over again. So the idea is basically to try and ask a question that's it's not so obscure, like, what would your wine pairing be with a chocolate tart? But it's something that, to ask them what they, a question that's broad but on topic in order to get them to think out loud, and that's, sometimes can be useful.
So it seems like those questions are important, especially in this age of hyper-partisan politics in the era of Fox News and MSNBC. However, you have a reputation for being very fair, very impartial in your work. And so, in this day and age, have you found it harder to maintain your bipartisan label in your new job as host of Face the Nation?
Well, if you're asking good questions, you're ticking off half of the country because you're asking a question that makes, we have Democrats on, you ask questions, and all the Republicans say, those are great questions, and the Democrats say, you're totally biased, and then the flip happens. So if you're doing it right, basically everybody hates you. But the hope is that when you ask the question, it's not obviously an act of trickery. You don't ask them a question that uses your advantage as a questioner who has a sense of the clock, who owns the stage in a way, to put them in an immediate disadvantage. And mostly if you're fair to the people you're interviewing by giving them time to talk, by not treating it like a court prosecution, where, again, you're using the drama of the moment to send signals to the viewers that they are already guilty or that there's an obvious answer they should give. Then people feel like at least they're being treated fairly, so that even if the question is difficult, then they feel like it's fair. And mostly they are okay with that.
The term I've heard is stinks. People have been like, your stinks I guess hard to read.
Yeah, well, that's good. I hope that's true.
During your time before Face the Nation, you were a correspondent for Time, and you were involved in a prominent story titled The War on Wilson, which involved the case about Valerie Plame and the CIA elite case during the Bush administration. This was a very controversial story. Would you mind giving the audience a quick background on the story and how you even came to be a part of it? Because there were many moving parts.
Yeah, okay, this is the memory motorway here. Okay, so George Bush in a State of the Union said that there was evidence that Iraq had been seeking yellow cake, which is essentially enriched uranium in Africa, and that there was proof of this. And this is part of building the case to go to war. There was a lot of debate about whether those 13 words in which he outlined that should have been included in the State of the Union, because there's a lot of doubt about whether Iraq was actually looking for enriched uranium. And the British intelligence services said they really weren't. The CIA had a huge internal fight about whether this should go into the speech. George Tenet, who was then the director of the CIA, it's hard to say what the truth of it was because there's been so much ass covering since then and claiming of what was said and what wasn't said. But basically, George Tenet, the director of the CIA, signed off on this. So the speech is given, and a guy named Joe Wilson writes an op-ed on July 6th, saying essentially he was the one who went on the mission to look for the yellow cake and whether the Iraq, in fact, was searching for this as part of developing a nuclear weapon, and that he didn't find anything. And so the White House obviously pushed back very hard against this idea. And the idea was, in part, that Wilson was not just some observer who was picked out of nowhere. That he was a perfectly unbiased observer of things. What they were hinting at behind the scenes was that Wilson had been sent by his wife, essentially. In other words, this wasn't some genius about yellow cake, which is what this enriched uranium is called. This is a guy who was basically sent on an errand by his wife. So, he doesn't know what he's talking about, because his wife just sent him, right? He wasn't like the person we'd absolutely pick to go figure this out. That's what they were saying behind the scenes to try to discredit him. So what our piece was about was the attempt to discredit Joe Wilson. Was the attempt by the White House behind the scenes to make him look like a disreputable source, and therefore he wasn't really debunking what the president had said. I was in Uganda with the president at the time, and the press secretary from the White House, Ari Fleischer, I can't remember what we put in the story at the time and what's come out subsequent to that, but he said, "Look who sent Wilson." He kept saying, "Look who sent him." In other words, trying to get us to go call the CIA and say, "Well, who sent this guy?" And then when we would then discover that his wife sent him, we would say, "Oh, well, so he didn't really get sent by them." There wasn't a process that picked him as the best guy. He was just a sort of house husband being given an errand by his wife. Anyway, we wrote that piece, and that became what led to a whole long series of months and months of coverage about those 13 words and how it was emblematic of the Bush administration's attempt to sell the war using faulty intelligence.
How do you handle a story like this in which the White House administration is very clearly against what you're reporting, and at the same time, similar to stuff like WikiLeaks, CIA agents' lives are endangered to an extent?
Yeah, in this case, there wasn't too much actual danger. I've never had to work on a story where some of the stories the New York Times particularly did during the Bush administration, they were dealing with things where the administration really would come out and say, you're going to get people killed. On this story, what you had, the big challenge on this story is that you had sources who you talk to on different levels of attribution. They tell you things, you make an agreement with them, basically. I won't quote you by name so that we can have a more open and fair conversation. The trick is you always want to stay on the right side of that relationship. So you don't want them to use that relationship to do what they were trying to do, which is off the record tell you, go look who sent him. And have you then do their dirty work for them. Once that starts happening, you get in trouble. And the reason this became an issue is if the White House specifically gave the name of Joe Wilson or his wife to reporters, it meant whoever did that was potentially breaking the law by knowingly outing an agent at the CIA. Now, knowingly is a crucial word because, and it's like a lot of things, there's a lot of talk about Hillary Clinton and whether she perjured herself in front of the House Government Oversight Committee. And the reason that's a little overblown as a claim is because in order for her to do it, it would have to be knowing perjury, and that's quite hard to so in other words, you can say a bunch of stuff and be wrong, and that's okay. You have to knowingly lie to be on the hook for it. And so the question in this case was, did the White House knowingly give the name of Valerie Plank, who was the woman who's married to Joe Wilson? Did they tell us that, and did they knowingly do it to out a CIA agent for the purposes of punishing her? Super specific statute. One of the other reporters on the story, Matt Cooper, who was covering the White House with me at the same time, had a conversation with Karl Rove, in which Rove was more specific than Ari Fleischer was with me when I was in Uganda, who gave up more information about who sent Wilson. But under ground rules that made it, if you were to keep the agreement, the ground rules between Cooper and Rove, that Cooper could not disclose who told him. So anyway, Matt Cooper went through a long fight with the Justice Department, which was investigating this. Ultimately, there was an arrangement where Karl Rove basically gave up his, released Cooper from their arrangement. And then we had lots and lots of court action, which essentially in the end ended up, the only one who was really punished for a separate, different story was Scooter Libby, who was the chief of staff of Vice President Cheney, who gave the information to a woman named Judith Miller, who was a reporter for the New York Times. And Libby was in fact indicted and charged, and then had his suspension. He wasn't pardoned, but he had his suspension vitiated, or he didn't have to serve any time because President Bush let him off the hook.
So now we're going to move into some questions about 2016 election and journalism leading up to November 8th. And so in March, the New York Times reported that Donald Trump had received about $2 billion in free publicity, and now that number is more close to about $3 billion. And so, as the host of a prominent television news show, you have a lot of power in what you cover. And by now you've interviewed Donald Trump about 20 times. And so how do you report on someone like Donald Trump without giving him the free publicity in a way that would service his own needs?
So there are different ways to think about publicity and airtime. The first thing I'd say is not all airtime is good for candidates. If you look at Donald Trump's numbers, there's a way you can look at it and think, whoever's numbers, somebody who has 60% unfavorable ratings, who gets 1% or lower of the African-American vote in battleground states, must have been the subject of intense press abuse. Nobody who has numbers who are that bad could have done that on his own without the Fourth Estate just totally training all of their attention on him for the purposes of ruining him. So it's not necessarily the case that all of the publicity that he's gotten has accrued to his benefit. The fact that he no longer does or hasn't been on our show since June, as he has pivoted away from his previous strategy, suggests that he doesn't see it as he used to as a kind of unavoided good. I think the biggest, so the $2 million, $3 million number is a little misleading because it makes it sound like it was $3 million's worth of great publicity. There's a reason that every other politician, every week we would say, okay, anybody can come on the show, and the only one who would say yes is Donald Trump. The others don't like all that free time because it doesn't often work out well for them. I think the place that we need to reinterrogate in this campaign is, well, there are many things to interrogate, but just in terms of free publicity, there was a period where, and this is still a little bit true, where his rallies were being carried in their full extent on cable networks with no editorial interruption or editorial frame. That's basically handing over your platform. Usually what happens when we interview him, I mean, he gets to say what he gets to say, but the questions are also ones that have caused him a lot of issues. I mean, whether it's about the judge overseeing the Trump University case, whether he whether he was or wasn't for the invasion in Libya, whether he thinks he could get a fair trial from a Muslim judge, whether he thinks abortion is murder. These are all things that answers that he gave in the course of interviews on our show created front page news. He would like to have all of those back. So the challenge, what you need to do is have a situation where you're pressing the candidate on what they believe. When you just let them run for an hour with no interruption, just straight on your television, that's where there's a super imbalance. And you can't right that imbalance unless you have an hour afterwards afterwards, and this wouldn't even really do it, of intense scrutiny of what was just said, and that wasn't what happened. So that's something that that needs to be rethought. But there are a lot of other things which we can talk about the nature of fact-checking and that kind of thing, which are part of this race, which we're learning about too.
And Faith the Nation aside, you are a journalist, and throughout your career as a journalist, you have reported through nearly every different kind of platform available to deliver news. You wrote for Time Magazine, you do a podcast for Slate, and now you are the host of Faith the Nation on television. And so, my question is this: what's the hardest part about being a journalist in this election cycle when all of these different platforms are available to you?
The platforms are helpful. That actually makes it easier because you can talk in different ways. The challenge with television is you have 6-7 minutes with a person you're interviewing. And you have 7 minutes, and you've got 8 questions. And actually, you guys are now experiencing this, right? You've got all these questions out there, you're waiting to get to it, and you just give shorter answers. So that's what happens. And there's another thing. So, if I'm talking and I say, and I should tell you about that time I killed a man. And then I continue talking, you're going to go, I should probably follow up about that time he killed a man. But I've done that so that we burn a bunch of time talking about the time I killed a man. And it turns out not to be me killing a man, it's just me singing, I killed a man in Reno and just to watch him die, and my fandom for Johnny Cash. And I just burned up the whole interview and all the rest of your questions. So that's the challenge of television, where you've got a clock and you don't. In print, you can do a lot more and a lot. That's what I've spent my whole career, 25 years doing. It's what I wanted to be coming out of college. So it's my more comfortable medium. A lot of times before the show on Sunday, I'll assign myself stories to write all the way through because I don't really know what I know until I write it. With the different podcasts I do the Slate Gab Fest, which is every week, which is a wonderful conversation with my colleagues that started basically, it was the conversation we had when we used to go walk to lunch. And it's experimental, it's thinking out loud, it's contrarian for the sake of learning about what we really believe about things. And that is a great way to break out of the kind of rut of the way we think, just because we're all in a collective enterprise, and it's usual or often that people come up with a kind of conventional wisdom, so we try and figure out what we really think about things. That is incredibly healthy, and the forum and the format helps that fertilizing process with thinking. And then the historical stuff is very helpful in terms of using history to judge the present. And then I do a podcast for Face the Nation called the Face the Nation Diary, which is just me kind of experimenting with ideas. It's again that idea of I've got to write it and think about it out loud before I know what I really believe. So that all helps me kind of think of my journalism a little bit better. In terms of covering this race, I guess that's helpful, but it doesn't get at some of the big challenges of this race, which is that you've got people self-selecting the mediums they want, people being impervious to fact-checking, not just the candidates, but the audience, and that kind of stuff. And the medium is not going to fix that. Those are bigger problems.
Another issue that has come up during this debate, which you just mentioned, or this race in general, is fact-checking and what the role of the moderator should be. So, forgive me if I get any of this wrong, but a lot has happened in the past couple days.
I'll fact-check.
Please fact-check. Chris Wallace said, and I believe he's been selected as debate moderator. Yes. And he says that it is not his job to fact-check candidates. That should happen. The other candidate should fact-check their opponent in real time. He's not going to say anything. Then, last week, Matt Lauer failed to fact-check Donald Trump's claim that he never supported the Iraq War. People were very angry at him. It seemed like he did not do a good job. And then, a couple days ago, Donald Trump said there should be no moderator. Why do we need a moderator?
How dare you say that?
Yeah, so my question is, what do you think the role? Oh, yeah. And you yourself moderated debate and fact-checked Ted Cruz, much to Ted Cruz's frustration.
Right.
So, in general, what do you think the role of a moderator is? And if we do lose the moderator, as Donald Trump would like, what do you think we're losing?
This is the rare 7-part question.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take them in order here. Okay, there are two different, I won't take them in order because and so those are all great questions. There's a difference between when you're doing an interview and moderating. So let's take them. Here's the big challenge with fact checking. What we know now from social science is that fact checking, it turns out, often drives people deeper into their misimpression than providing sunlight and disinfection and revelation. So a lot of times you have candidates and administrations now saying something they know to be untrue in the hopes that they will be fact-checked. And so that a lot of time will be spent fact-checking. And what will happen is people will take the false statement and start to believe that, and that they will get no penalty for being fact-checked. So basically, as a politician, if you're not getting 4 Pinocchios, you're doing it wrong. So that's a problem. And it's a problem for the way our democracy works. It's a problem for trying to deal with facts. And it's a problem when you're doing an interview, because when somebody says something and you know it not to be true, do you take the time to do the fact check, even though at the end you may have created a net reduction in understanding, while nevertheless trying to do something that you thought was going to actually increase understanding? So that's the big challenge and big problem. And so that's a big issue that needs to be. And then in interviews, just one more thing. A lot of times, as I said earlier about the I shot a man example, candidates will say something they know will call for a fact check, or that will get them fact checked, in order to take you down a rabbit hole. So you spend 3 or 4 minutes dealing with that thing, and whatever else you were going to ask about, you're just not going to have any time for. And also, finally, one other thing is that if I can get in a fight with you about fact-checking on an issue, a lot of politics is about owning the territory that the debate is about, not necessarily whether you're right or wrong. So if you're a Republican, it used to be true, on taxes. If you and I are having a long debate about you fact-checking me on taxes, I'm in great shape. Because the more people hear about taxes, that's an issue that's good for me as a Republican. They just tend to think Republicans handle that issue better. They think that whatever I'm saying is likely, or it's potentially true, that they're likely to think what I'm saying is more commanding. I want the topic to be about taxes. So I want to stay on taxes. I don't want to go talk about the other stuff you want to talk about. So by encouraging a fact check, I'm keeping the issue control on my set of issues. So that's in the interview context, where you nevertheless have an obligation to obviously follow up, obviously check facts, but you must balance that against your hope to get to other questions that might be more revelatory and more informative. So that's in the interview context. When you're a moderator, it's a little different, because moderation of a debate is not 2 separate interviews. It's really a debate between the candidates, and you want them to debate each other because your hope is that in the conversation between the 2 of them, you'll illuminate the differences that people ultimately have to make their choices about. It's a choice between 2 people, so you've got to know where the differences are between the 2 of them. So you want them to engage, in my view. On the other hand, they've got to engage on a playing field that is at least one that has something to do with reality. So I think that you fact check to get the terms of the debate correct. So that somebody can't start off and say, well, this is really a debate about this, and then say something that's false. Because what they're trying to do is shift the debate over here, which means whatever answer they give is being judged over here. You want it to be judged on the right platform. So I think you have to, and then you have this other challenge, which is when Donald Trump says he was against the Iraq War, it's an untrue statement. It's not a matter of quibbling. He said he was for the Iraq War. Secondly, the point of his saying that, so that's the fact point. So it's not true he was against the Iraq War before it started. It's just not true. That's a little different than some of the other facts we check, which are a little bit more at issue. It also depends on, and so I don't know what I would do if I were a moderator and he said that. Different than being an interviewer. I think as an interviewer, you have to jump in, because what he's doing is, that's not just some obscure fact. His argument is, because I was against the Iraq War and because I was against the action in Libya, I have a greater judgment than Hillary Clinton, even though she has all this experience. Experience, I have better judgment. Barack Obama used that argument about the war, and Bernie Sanders used that argument. But they had more standing to do it because they, in fact, had stood up before the war and said this is a dumb war. Donald Trump does not have access to that argument because he didn't do that. So it's not just like some small fact. It is a fact upon which he is basing his entire argument about his judgment. The same is true with Libya. He supported action in Libya and now says he was against it. So in that case, when he's really resting so much of his claim on a fact like that, it's more than just kind of making sure you get facts straight. Does the moderator have to jump in? I think the moderator should jump in sparingly. The reason you have to be, and in a way that doesn't make people think you are putting a thumb on the scale. That's the problem, because ultimately people have to make the choice. And if they think you have skewed the debate, then you've got a whole host of people who can't make a choice, or they feel the choice is unfair, and that's doing huge damage to the process. So I don't know how I would have done it if I were moderating one of the debates. It was a big item on the to-do list. It was at the top of the to-do list if I had moderated one of the debates in terms of trying to work out that balance. Sorry, long question. Long answer.
So we're going to transition now to questions from the audience. These were...
Sorry, one other thing, the no moderator point, it's important. Here's why it's not great just to have the opponent fact check the other opponent. We've all seen this in debates. One candidate just fires like out of a Gatling gun 15 false claims. Their opponent, again, it's about issue control. Their opponent then tries to fact check them on those 15. And you know what their opponent does? Eats up all their time fact checking whatever the other person has said. So they've just wasted they didn't get to say anything about what they believe. They spent all their time on defense, like swatting down all these facts. So it's a tool, saying things that are inaccurate or that incite a response from your opponent is a tool one uses to control the debate. And so without a moderator to short circuit that, you are allowing kind of trickery to control a debate that's supposed to be about an airing of ideas and a finding of differences. And so that's why the model of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is just two men and a timekeeper, doesn't work anymore. Also in part because you don't have the time that Lincoln and Douglas had to debate kind of a single issue. Now we're kind of all over the map, so you can't kind of stick with an issue long enough so that somebody can both fact check and get their review out. Anyway, sorry about that.
Okay, so we have some questions that the audience filled out, and we'll just get through them one by one. And so our first question is, sometimes a candidate deflects your piercing questions. You then ask one, perhaps two, following questions. So how do you know how much to press and when to back off? Knowing the candidate may not come back on the show if they see you as being too tough.
It's a great question. So this is what it's. I think you just. So I have two contraries. And there's a third person in there, which is the audience. I have two examples of this with Donald Trump. One was on when Corey Lewandowski, his campaign manager, had grabbed a female reporter. Videotape of it came out and said that showed that he had in fact grabbed her. She had claimed previously that he and Donald Trump had said basically she was delusional. My feeling was this was a moment to interrogate Donald Trump as a manager. When you're president, you're a manager. So how does he deal with a subordinate who said something that didn't turn out to be true, that gave him the candidate information that didn't turn out to be true? And I asked it over and over again. It got nowhere. Trump is fine with all this stuff, even stuff that gets him on the front page of the newspaper, and it's not good for him. He's very adult about all that, which is to his credit. The people who hated that were a lot of the viewers. They didn't know why I wouldn't get off this topic. They thought I was, even people who don't like Trump. So what I learned there was, people say they want a lot of follow-ups. In practice, following up can be really messy. And really, it can seem tedious. It can seem pointless. It's not so much what people say they want. It's like when people say they want to hear policy discussions. If they hear a real policy discussion, the number of people who leave the room after you get into the 45th minute of your policy discussion. Now, having said that, when I asked him about Judge Curiel, the judge overseeing his Trump University case, I think I asked him a version of the same question about 7 times. I felt like it was important to get at what his baseline view was on this, not just about the case, but about his view about groups of people and And it ultimately ended up being really revelatory and interesting. And again, he's an adult. Like he came, well, he hasn't come back since that, actually. But by God, I'm sure he will. Anyway, so it is a balance. And the other thing is, it's not so much about them coming back or not coming back. It's just basically losing your audience. Because they're like, you're not getting anywhere. Why do you keep doing this? So.
This one is, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. Is Donald Trump more like Barry Goldwater or George Wallace? The history names out there.
Yes. So these are 2 chapters of the book. 1968, George Wallace runs as a third-party candidate, running on an argument of basically resentment that you, the voters, have been ignored by both parties. I'm your champion. They've looked down on you. And he was seen as a joke at first. People thought that he was put up by the Johnson forces to basically create trouble for Nixon. So in the sense that Wallace was playing on a certain sense of resentment in the country, that he claimed to have kind of super fast, common sense solutions to intractable problems, that he ran against the institution of Washington and government, all very familiar with Trump, that he had a big, strong law and order pitch, very familiar with Trump, although in 1968 there were real law and order issues. You turn on the evening news every night and there were smoldering buildings from riots in cities. Bobby Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King was killed. The riots at the 68 convention, like that was real violence. National Guard having to be called out to quell riots in the cities and people dying. That was different than what we have today. So Donald Trump uses sometimes the language of George Wallace when he talks about law and order. The situation on the ground is not the same. Goldwater thing is, the parallel doesn't work when you think Goldwater was an ideological candidate who had a set of beliefs that he stuck to his political detriment. He didn't vote for the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and got a challenge in his own party for that. 19 Republican governors were against him, there was a Stop Goldwater movement, which was much more robust even than the Never Trump movement. The leader of that, or one of the leaders of that movement, was George Romney, governor of Michigan at the time, whose son Mitt was trying to lead the Never Trump movement, which is an interesting parallel. So in the sense that there was a guy who was just being opposed by the establishment, that's the similarity there. But Goldwater, as a political figure, had a sense of restraint and ideology that Trump is not an ideologue at all, and his sense of restraint has yet to really demonstrate itself, except with respect to Hillary Clinton's recent illness, in which he has been pretty restrained in his response, basically hewing to the old political rule that when your opponent's in trouble, just let them be in trouble, don't get in the way. So I guess those would be the parallels I would draw.
Sure. So one topic that has been strikingly absent from the campaign is climate change. Do you see this changing? What do you see the discourse about climate change going after the election, and what obligation do journalists have to discuss climate change and make it part of it?
Yeah, I would assume that it would be in all 3 of the debates. The reason it hasn't been that much of a conversation at the moment is that in primary debates, you try to illuminate what the differences are between the candidates. The candidates can spend a lot of time and money educating people on what they believe. The voters have access to, either through their own internet connection or through a public library, to the position papers of the candidates on global warming. And they'll find them in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party very similar. So if you ask a question in the extremely limited amount of time you have in a debate, you're basically going to get 2 candidates saying essentially the version of the same thing, right after each other. It doesn't illuminate anything. The job of the debate is to illuminate the differences and then put them in context, or try to keep them in context, which is a tricky thing to do. But in the general election, there are big differences between the 2 candidates on that crucial issue. And I should think that it would be in all of the debates. Because it's not just, it's about energy, it's about long-term planning, it's about infrastructure, it's about the earth, it's about a whole bunch, climate change and energy policy touches on a whole bunch of stuff that not only illuminates what those candidates believe about the actual issues, but also about sort of the way they think and tackle problems and their prioritization. It can tell you all kinds of different and interesting things, so I should think it would come up a lot, because there are real differences.
How much more time do we have for questions? Cool. All right. So I'll ask this question, and I think we should also discuss your book, which What question are you most proud of asking?
Huh. You know, I don't know what I'm ready. I mean, gosh, that's a great, I don't know. So the one that, I don't know if I'm, I don't know. Well, it's weird because you don't want to be like, I'm so proud of myself. Well, I guess it's, I don't know. So I guess two. It depends what your frame is, you know. So I think I'm proud of the questions I've asked both of the candidates this year that I think have illuminated really like who they are. But I asked you, so, but then there's these two other things which seem to me in a kind of in a larger sense more important. So I asked John Boehner after he left after he stepped down as speaker. You know, he brought the Pope to speak to Congress, and he'd been working on doing this for 20 years. He finally did it, and so at the end of the interview, I said, you know, so the Pope came, and then basically the next day, Boehner stepped down. So he's Catholic, I'm a Catholic, and I asked him if he felt like the Holy Spirit had moved him to decide to step down as speaker. And I can't remember what his answer was in the show. It was like, oh, maybe, I don't know, could be. And then the show ended. So I thought, well, you know, you try those kind of, that's a question where you think, this might tell us something about the way this guy thinks, about the way religion, the role it plays in his life. It'll take us out of this moment we're in, which was mostly the interview was about, like, the Republican Party fighting inside itself. Anyway, he called me a couple of days later, and I thought, oh my God, something's, you know, like, he's going to yell at me for something I asked him, or like, I don't know, something's gone wrong. He didn't really call me a lot, so. Anyway, he said that he had thought about the question, and he had asked the Cardinal in Washington that question. And he called me to say, you know, I didn't realize until you asked it that of course that's what happened. And he said it was a real revelation to me about that moment. And I wouldn't have had that revelation and asked the Cardinal and talked about it with him if you hadn't asked that question. So that was a kind of a human thing. It doesn't help the country, I don't think, which is what I mean, you know, 4 million people every week tune in to try and figure out what's going on with their country, and that's an incredible obligation that I take super seriously, and this didn't really go to that, but it did sort of get somewhere in a question in a public figure's life that we don't normally get to. So that was interesting and different. And then there was another one sort of along the same lines about asking why Republicans didn't do a poverty summit the way they have summits for agriculture and other things that I wrote about in a story that ended up leading to a summit on the issue of poverty that the Republican candidates participated in as part of the primaries. So I felt like that was that did some good in the world, I think. So I don't know. It makes me very comfortable answering that question. It's a good question.
So we want to talk about your new book, Whistlestop, that you just published, which is about crazy moments during past presidential elections. And so all the time we hear people say, never before has an election like this happened. And we were wondering if you think that's true, and have there been any campaigns before that mirror what's happening now?
So a lot of things have happened before, but not in the exact same way. There's been no reality show candidate like Donald Trump. Obviously, there's never been a marketer. So we've had businessmen, Wendell Willkie, who got the Republican nomination in 1940, after having been a Democrat the year and a half before, much like Trump, who was a Democrat 2 years ago. Willkie leapt over all the guys who were in front of him in line. This is back when things were more unpredictable, although I guess they've been sufficiently unpredictable this season. Leapt over the competition the way Trump leapt over his competition. But he's been a Wall Street lawyer and was a utilities company executive. Donald Trump is a marketer, and campaigns are basically and have been in the television age about marketing. So that's new. But the outsider who challenges the establishment of their party is not only Wallace, Goldwater, McGovern, but it goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson in 1824. They thought here's this general, he's not fit and doesn't care about the presidency. They're just running him for president for local political reasons in Tennessee. He's not serious. Other people thought it was an effort to basically steal votes so that John Quincy Adams could win the presidency. So in that sense, the press was wrong then, as they were wrong this time. There's a great history of basically the elites and the press being totally wrong about how the races are going to unfold. And you know, the other thing that was really interesting about Jackson is that people at the time worried that they didn't want to elect someone so much based on that person's personality. Jackson was essentially a war hero, won the Battle of New Orleans, and they thought people are going to vote for him just because he's a war hero. It's the equivalent of voting for somebody just because they're a reality show guy and you know their name and they're popular, and that would be a disaster because people would be voting based on their emotions, not based on reason, and that they would be voting based on this idea that a single human being could solve and fix the problems that the country was facing. So when Donald Trump says, "I alone can fix it," it's very much channeling that fear they had about Jackson in 1824. And then Jackson's response was, when the elites attacked me, he said, "I will grow based on their abuse," which is basically what Trump has said for a while. He doesn't really believe it because he gets so upset about the abuse, which some people would just call fair coverage. But he's not wrong about the fact that, and this is one of the reasons when we go back to fact-checking, the people that love Donald Trump are the least likely to take a fact-check from the New York Times very seriously. They're likely to take it the opposite way. They're likely to think the New York Times has a doubt for Donald Trump and they're making it all up. So, in that sense, Donald Trump has grown by his supporters thinking that the elites are out to get him. If he's getting grief from them, he must be doing something right. And so that's a parallel to 1824, which was, you know, a little while ago.
I guess our final question before we close is a question we almost ask every speaker is, what advice would you give to a current college student trying to figure out what to do with their life? Talk briefly about that.
Well, I don't know. I guess I would say when I was out, you know, sitting in seats like that when I was in school, my last 2 years of college, I had a lot of fun in my first 2 years. My last 2 years, I worked much, sort of harder than I should have. I mean, I guess obviously in some ways it paid off, but I was really, I'd like to have some of that time back. Both, just, I mean, to have fun, but also just to relax, to not accelerate the pace of life so much faster, because it's going to accelerate itself on its own the minute you get out. And I guess that's hard to do if you're a kind of strivery person, the way I was, and I'm suspecting maybe one or two of you all are. I mean, you didn't get in here because, you know, you could play marbles well. So the question is, I think that, well, the other thing is that I would, if I were talking to myself back in those seats, I would sort of say it's going to be all right. A lot of things are going to thwart you, and you're going to think, you're going to really want something to happen, and it will not happen. And it will be a crushing blow. And then there will be some number of years, probably not that many, when you will forget the details of the thing that was once so crushing. Because you learn to adapt, and you learn to fail quickly, and do embarrassing things, and not just sort of gnaw at your stomach because of it. Now, it may be impossible to offer this wisdom to the extent that that's what it is. You may just have to experience it. So you may just have to make an ass of yourself, and then feel like what that's like, and then get on it afterwards and realize, okay, I didn't die. You know, I was able to pick up and move on. You may just have to experience that. But if you do have to experience that and don't just take it as the received wisdom of me, at least when it happens, you'll know, oh, okay, it is supposed to happen this way. And the reason I say all of that is that there are even in a career that moves along, you know, a relatively straight line, there are going to be times where you think, like, this is a disaster. This is not what I wanted. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I am. It's okay. That's the biggest piece of advice. The other just tactical advice is learn something. If you're interested in journalism, particularly, just learn something. Learn about science, math, history, English. Learn that. You'll figure out how to tell it later. Somebody can teach you pretty quickly how to say it. Learn how to write. even if you don't want to be in journalism, learn how to write. Very few people know how to write anymore. And because, you can change somebody's life with a thank you note or a note when their father dies, and you explain what their father meant to them. Even if your job requires no writing, just being able to write well can, in just a single piece of writing, you can change somebody's life or bring them comfort in a way that is hard to do sometimes in our world where we live, sort of all digitally. So learn something, learn how to write, and it'll all be okay.
That's why you should write for the
Yeah,
politics.
everyone writes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Keep an eye out for our other events, like The Politic on Facebook. Check out our pictures from tonight. And I hope you enjoy your time tonight. Thanks.